Hi, this is Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute, and welcome to VantagePoint. Today I have with me my good friend Jasmine El-Gamal. Jasmine has had a 7-8 year career at the Defense Department. She's been an advisor on Middle East issues for 4 secretaries of defense, including Defense Secretary Robert Gates, Leon Panetta, Chuck Hagel, and Ash Carter. She's also been desk officer for Iraq and Syria and Lebanon at different times in the Defense Department. She is currently a resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, where she focuses on issues of radicalization and violent extremism, particularly the role of narrative in that dynamic. She follows closely the dynamics of radicalization, certainly in the Middle East, but also, in a sense, recently in the United States as well. Jasmine, thanks for coming, and it's very nice to have you. Let me also add that Jasmine writes regularly in Time Magazine, the Huffington Post, and many other outlets, and has also been a commentator on TV on issues relating to the Middle East, as well as issues relating to domestic sort of situation in the U.S., as relates to radicalization and so on. Let's start first from the moment we're in now, right after the election that took place, in which one might say there's been radicalization in the United States itself. How do you see that as somebody who studies radicalization?
I think it's an absolutely true statement to make if you look at this, the current climate that we find ourselves in, coming on the heels of an incredibly contentious presidential election where minority communities and other communities as well were scapegoated and blamed for lots of problems and kind of creating this polarization in society where one felt like you had to take sides between one group and the other, or where one group was blaming problems, whether it's terrorism or economic problems on one specific group in society. We found ourselves in a place now where you really do feel a radicalization on all sides of society in the U.S., not just among people worry about Muslim radicalization, but you see the rise of the alt-right, as they call it, and it's just a pretty disturbing trend in general.
Well, as somebody who has studied radicalization, certainly from the Defense Department in the Middle East and parts of the Islamic world, and the study of radicalization, what fuels it, why do people become radicalized? And this is a phenomenon that, we're seeing to some degree. Maybe it started in the Middle East, we've seen it a bit in the US, seeing it in Europe and so on. What are some takeaways sort of from the study of radicalization that are useful to understanding sort of this general moment that we're going through?
It's a good question. It's a really complicated question. Obviously there's no one cause of radicalization, and it really depends on where you are and the moment in time and the country and the region and all of that stuff. But I'll just a couple of examples of root causes of radicalization, for example. One is economic hardship and the lack of opportunity. The other is conflict and avoid insecurity that causes people to be vulnerable and therefore susceptible to recruitment by extremism. You see that in places where there are conflicts like Syria and Iraq and other places like that. Economic hardship, you see it in Western countries, for example, where minority communities are feeling extremely rejected and discriminated against, and so that makes them a little bit more susceptible than the average human when it comes to radicalization. So the causes are numerous. The causes are many. One of the biggest things that I found to be extremely damaging to the resilience of a society, which makes some members of society susceptible to radicalization, is this process of otherizing someone who doesn't look like you or someone who's not exactly like you. And that's what we've seen in the US and in Western Europe, for example, over the last couple of years, for a variety of reasons, one of which is the massive flow of refugees coming in from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, majority Muslim refugees into majority non-Muslim countries, which has really caused this intense reaction on the part of many people in society, where they look at them and they say, no,
these are different.
These are
we
different.
Don't know enough about
You're
them.
the other.
So I'm
afraid of you. And I feel like a lot of, whether it's politicians or certain members of society have capitalized on that to the point where it becomes very easy to form radical thoughts, both against those minorities. So now we're talking about, the alt-right, white extremists, whatever you want to call it, or on the part of these Muslim minorities.
Well, let's look at it sort of from a policy perspective within the United States. The Obama administration and the U.S. and the Bush administration, and starting with George W. Bush right after 9/11, part of his considered strategy was to embrace the Muslim American community. They're Americans, obviously one should embrace them anyway, but in addition, his point was, and then after him President Obama, that as a strategy to isolate and diffuse if there's somebody getting radicalized, the best approach is to work with Americans who happen to be Muslims and embrace that community and integrate them to avoid the dynamics that you're talking about. And with this administration, you feel a different approach, or there is a different approach, or it seems to be, that there's already a kind of an othering, like you said. But you've been at the Defense Department, you've worried about these things, and you've been with people who are worrying about these things. Does this strategy worry you in terms of how things might develop in the United States?
Yes, in a word, in a nutshell. I'm extremely concerned, as are many people who are, not just who work on these issues, but who live in this country in general. So I want to take a step back and look at, to answer your question, to start answering your question when it comes to the differences and the similarities between the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and now the Trump administration. If you talk to Muslim American activists in the U.S. or civil liberties lawyers, or people whose job it is to focus on these issues, it isn't necessarily that one administration did everything right and another administration did everything wrong. It's not like the Bush administration was terrible and the Obama administration was great and now we're back to terrible. That's way too simplistic of a view when it comes to looking at these issues. Both the Bush and the Obama administration tried different things. We all remember September 11th. It was an incredible shock, an incredibly traumatic event, and it was something that had never really happened to us before in that way. And we kind of were struggling to figure out how to deal with it. We had to deal with it in real time. And I saw that both here on the ground in the U.S., but then also in Iraq when I was a translator in Iraq in early 2003 with the U.S. military, and I could see on the ground, I experienced on the ground how day to day, we not only was Washington grappling with how to deal with these issues of terrorism and attacks on the homeland and so on, but what did that mean for the troops? What did that mean for us on the ground? What did that mean for our relationship with Middle Eastern countries? All of these things. And so there was a lot of trial and error over the Bush years. And when the Obama administration came into power, they also went through quite a bit of trial and error and there were some programs that were not necessarily super successful and they tried to change. However, the one difference that I want to point out, and again, because I look at narratives and how, how important they are in setting the tone for policy, both the Bush and the Obama administrations took incredible care in how they talked about these issues and how they talked about extremism and how they talked about terrorism, how they talked about us as Americans, as a society, and the role of Muslims in American society as Americans themselves. And they both took great care to continually say, Islam is not the problem. This is not about a religion. This is about people. This is about a small group of people, extremists, and so on.
I want to interject. Also
Please.
Give you a break, but there's an interesting, and I think I said it a couple of times ago, a story of a very radical group of religious, that we're familiar with, that took over a city and beheaded the people, enslaved the women, and so on. This is a group of Anabaptists who took over Munster, Germany in 1534, and it took a regional European coalition to dislodge them.
Sounds very familiar.
People hijacking religions is a problem that's been around on and off in various religions. So just to give you a break.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think it's incredibly important to try really hard to remember that this is not the first time we've had to deal with extremism as humans, as human beings. It's existed as long as human beings have existed. And so to say, and that's the difference that you see with the current leadership and the current administration, is the way that they talk about the problem is very different. And the reason that disturbs me is because the president and his team, but especially the president, really sets the tone for how, what vision he has for this country, what vision he wants to bring people along to. And, and during his inauguration address, he did say that he wanted to be a president for all Americans, I think, and he made some comments about inclusivity. But when you take that and you compare it then with the way that he talks about Muslims, the way that some of his staff members talk, not about Muslims, but about the religion of Islam itself, it's pretty scary. It's pretty disturbing. There's an executive order that's supposed to come out tomorrow that's going to go into this a little bit more as it pertains to refugees and immigrants from certain countries, and we can talk about that at some point if you'd like.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a point. Yeah.
But the point is, the problem is, again, with the rhetoric and the narrative and the tone that you're setting. If you as the president are trying to bring the country together after what's been an incredibly traumatic 2 years, honestly, for many of us,
Sure.
If you are trying to bring all Americans together to fight certain threats against America, which you have to, because the only way we're going to do it is to do it together as a country. By singling out an entire religion, you somehow make it acceptable to think that simply because you adhere to that religion, there is a chance that you are more susceptible to violence or extremism than anyone else. There is a chance that you're more problematic as a person because you adhere to that religion as a citizen, because you adhere to a religion that you have deemed problematic.
So, yeah, I mean, it's obvious, but to summarize, I mean, you're very concerned about this direction, that it creates divisions rather than working together. There's a risk of being more separate and creating layers of problems. Our time is limited, and I want to get to a number of things, and I'm going to go to another different direction. The Defense Department, in a sense, is well placed to guide national security policy today. General Michael Flynn, who's a general from, he was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and so on, is now the National Security Advisor. And obviously, General Mattis is or will be the Secretary of Defense. So two generals, effectively, guiding much of national security policy, with a very clear and very well understood focus on defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're also, maybe issue of the Muslim Brotherhood is also getting thrown in. But let me go straight to the war on ISIS. Obviously, there is an enormous priority. President Trump said it in his inauguration speech. The National Security Advisor, who in the past usually had a broad view of China, was the person who integrated all the different issues. General Flynn is very focused on the war, I would think, on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and has been a warrior in that. So there's obviously a focus on that, but the strategy surrounding it is not clear. Obviously, there will be maybe more resources put in the fight, but there is no appetite for many boots on the ground. That's one question. President Trump says he wants to work with Russia, but General Flynn, General Mattis think Russia's an enemy. That's a problem. President Trump says he wants to work with Russia, in a sense, and the Assad regime in Syria, but General Flynn, General Mattis consider Iran, who is part of that coalition, an implacable enemy. So how is this going to play out in terms of, trying to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq? But there's Russia, there's Iran, there's the Assad regime, there's Sunnis, the strategy is not clear. How do you see all of that? I know that's not a small question.
It's not. It's how much time do we have?
Some thoughts.
Okay, that is a very broad question. It's a very important question.
Yeah.
It's we can really spend a lot of time talking about this question. I would point out a couple of things. Well, first of all, the strategy isn't clear because President Trump just took office. I mean, it's been the first week, and we don't really know what the strategy is, other than it is a top priority to defeat, as President Trump said in his address,
Sure.
what he and his team are calling is radical Islamic extremism. And so we know that'll be a priority. In terms of General Mattis and General Flynn, I worked, not personally very closely, but General Mattis was the commander of Central Command when I was at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And so I had a chance to work closely with his team and to observe his leadership and to observe his thoughts and the way that he thought about this stuff. And I have to tell you that it gives me great comfort to know that someone like General Mattis is part of this team. I have incredible respect and confidence for him. And I think that because, not simply because of his experiences at CENTCOM, but partly because of his experiences at CENTCOM, he had to deal with issues.
Very complex issues.
Very complex issues in every single country in the region. I mean, he would, traveled back and forth and worked with the Gulf and, Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, all these different countries. And so General Mattis has an incredibly nuanced view of these complex problems and the challenges that we solve. And I think, you mentioned him being a general. I mean, he's retired, so he's going into the Department of.
It's not a bad thing. I'm just describing that they're coming from a.
They're coming from a military background,
yeah.
and I think what that does, is he knows very well the price of military action, of boots on the ground, of an overly securitized lens of looking at different topics. And so what I would imagine coming from him is a little bit more caution than you might find from some others when it comes to addressing problems like extremism or ISIS or other kinds of problems, because he knows, as do many people who've worked in the military at the Department of Defense and other places in the US government, that it's not the solution. You won't kill your way out of this problem. So if we look at the military aspects...
Yeah, in a sense, it's the military people who know most the limits of what military can
action.
do. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's a great opportunity to come into this and look at this with a very holistic view. General Kelly at the Department of Homeland Security, I also had a chance to interact with him when I was the Syria country director. He was the senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and I just similarly have incredibly huge respect for him and his abilities, and I feel comfortable knowing that he's at DHS.
Yeah, very complex issue. So Jasmine, let me ask you a bit about CVE, which is countering violent extremism. This was an element of policy and strategy to, other than attacking ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other than the intelligence work to find cells that are planning things, it was a program in the US, and the Europeans had it as well, to work maybe with communities to make sure people don't become radicalized, or if they're becoming radicalized, have ways to deal with it before FBI and intelligence. And this started, I think, under the President Bush and continued under President Obama and will continue maybe in a different form. Where does that stand now? As you said, we're still early days in the administration, but where do you think that domestic program of countering violent extremism is going?
So, countering violent extremism, as it currently stands, addresses all forms of extremism, and is part of programs throughout the U.S. government, including the USAID, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security. There's domestic CVE, there's international CVE, and because in the Obama administration there was a belief that you had to really address the myriad root causes of extremism in order to fight it, you'll find current CVE programs spanning,
domestically,
both domestic and mostly international, spanning a wide range of areas. So it has in some countries it's more economically focused, because in those countries we've determined that economics are the main driver of extremism, whereas in another place it could be another issue. What the Trump administration has indicated, again, we saw this when he used the term Islamic extremism in the inauguration speech, is that they want to move away from the term countering violent extremism to countering Islamic extremism or countering
Just
radical
per
Islamic
se,
extremism. Again, we have to wait and see what happens. But the Trump team, during the election and now certainly has always been very critical of the Obama administration, and not just the Trump team. Many, people have criticized the Obama administration for not using,
Not
sort of
using the
accusing
term
them of
Islamic
running away
extremism.
from the term Islamic
ISIS obviously,
extremism, and using countering violent extremism as an alternative term when really what they're talking about is Islamic extremism. And I don't think that criticism is entirely unfair. What I worry about and what I am concerned about, having dealt with these issues and having spoken to people around the world who deal with these issues, is if countering violent extremism is a very valid effort. And you can say that underneath that umbrella, there are elements of extremists that use an interpretation of Islam, and there are other elements that use, whether it's
Other
white
things and other
supremacy. I mean,
ideologies. The Norwegian
Dylan Roof,
radical.
the Norwegian terrorist Breivik. I mean, all these people were also terrorists. They had ideological motives and committed violence in order to achieve those ends. And so my worry is that by focusing it on, by
Labeling
removing
it,
that
sort of,
term, and just focusing on Islamic extremism, again, you make it about one religion, and maybe to the detriment or at the expense of really all kinds of extremism that could have nothing to do with religion. To me, it seems a bit of a premature step, and I wouldn't, I don't think many people would have objected. I know I certainly would have objected if we keep the term CVE and then have different categories, because it would be silly to ignore the fact that there are terrorists who use
and call
Islam.
them as such and so on. Yeah.
So call a spade a spade. I have no problem with that. But to make it just about that religion, again, to go back to our discussion earlier, I think does much more harm than good when it comes to this battle that we're also invested in.
Battle of narratives, as
Yes.
you say. In our last little segment, let's get to the executive order, the issue of immigration, the limiting of immigration, banning of some forms of immigration. What's your reading of that executive order and how it will play out? And what is its impact, perhaps, in the U.S. or if there's an impact? I mean, the U.S. hasn't been taking many refugees anyway. But what are some of the things that stand out for you in the executive order and its impact?
The executive order deals with, it's called Protecting the Nation from Terrorist Attacks by Foreign Nationals. And it's really meant to, fulfill a campaign promise that President Trump made, which is to pause and really look at what's happening and who's coming into the country and why and how, and figure out whether there are any flaws in the system or anything that we could be doing better to protect our country, which, in itself is not a negative thing at all. And again, this is where I come back to the narrative aspect and to the way that we talk about these issues. Protecting the country from foreign terrorists or potential terrorists is a great thing.
Yeah.
I think we can all be on board with that. The way that he proposes to do it raises some questions in my mind and raises some questions in a lot of people's minds. I mean, you've seen the reaction in the last couple of days in the lead up to the executive order being published. I mean, it ranges from relief from part of the constituency that voted for President Trump, especially on these issues, to slight worry, concern, but kind of like a wait and see, to full-blown panic.
And the panic is where?
The panic is where. So I'll tell you a couple of provisions that we think will be in the executive order. For example, it blocks refugees from Syria from entering the U.S. indefinitely, which when on the face of it, it sounds kind of ominous to a lot of people in the U.S. I mean, a lot of people have been very anti-letting Syrian refugees in because, it sounds kind of bad. It sounds scary. There's a war. People are fleeing. We don't know who they are. We don't want them here, right? Except that if you look really closely at it, the vetting process in order for refugees to come into the U.S., it's a 2-year-long process, and it's extremely rigorous. It's very different, by the way, from the situation that Europe faces. I mean, that's a whole other issue. I'm talking about the United States.
I mean, those weren't vetted refugees; they were people flooding border posts.
To go into Europe is much easier than coming to the United States. You get on a rubber boat, you go, you cross the water, you land in Greece.
It's harder
and
to get across the Atlantic in a
little bit harder to get across the Atlantic.
Okay.
Yeah, especially in a rubber raft. I don't think that
Few
would do
have
the
made
trick.
it.
Few have braved
the Atlantic
journey.
currents.
So it's an incredibly rigorous process. Many of the refugees that are coming to the U.S. are women and children, families who are genuinely fleeing carnage in Syria. And, if you look at...
So that's a humanitarian.
It's a humanitarian
aspect.
thing, but it's also a security aspect, because you look
at...
at...
some people are
panicking. I'll tell you why they're panicking. I just want to make a very quick point about the Syrian refugees, is that not a single Syrian refugee in the U.S. has committed any sort of terrorist attack or anything like that. Zero levels. The reason why some people are panicking, and I just want to read a provision from what we think will be in the EO. So it says, in order to protect Americans, we must ensure that those admitted to this country do not bear hostile attitudes towards our country and its founding principles. We won't admit people who don't support the U.S. Constitution or those who would place violent religious edicts over American law. Now, I don't know about you, but people read this, I read this, and I think this is about Muslims. I mean, tell me if you have a different opinion, but here's where I mean, the United States should not admit those who engage in acts of bigotry and hatred, including honor killings. Again, these are all great things. We don't want people performing honor killings in the U.S. Is this the place to talk about it? Is this the way to talk about it? Is it? Are you bringing people together? Are you helping Americans learn to accept, know one another in order to work together as a resilient society by kind of picking out one group and subjecting them to a little bit extra scrutiny
a key
than
concept,
everybody
a resilient
else.
society, an integrated, resilient society is sort of the best defense, rather than a...
The ironic thing is I don't think anybody disagrees with President, whether it's President Trump or his supporters. I mean, there's such an incredible animosity between, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Hillary, anti-Hillary. Nobody disagrees on the fact that we need to keep our country safe. And if the president wants to take steps to keep our country safe, I know I will line up behind him and help him keep the country safe. But can we really do that by dividing our society and making people afraid of each other? Can we really do that by taking a religion, an entire religion, and saying, everybody think twice about people from that religion? How does that make us safer? Those are some of the questions that I have. Those are some of the questions
that leads us back to maybe radicalization, the othering.
If we had a longer, if we were having a longer discussion, we could talk about, psychology and human nature and sociology and everything. All these sciences that tell us that the more people dehumanize the person in front of them, the more likely we are to take radical, extreme, violent action against them, because we don't see them as human beings. We don't see them as equal to us.
We should have learned that lesson many times through history.
Many times over.
But we don't have more time. So we have to end here. Jasmine, thank you very much for being with us today. Fascinating discussion. You tweet, don't you?
I tweet.
What is your Twitter
Jasmine
handle?
El-Gamal.
At Jasmine El-Gamal?
At Jasmine El-Gamal.
All right, and she's at the Atlantic Council. You can see her writings there. Thank you for being with us on VantagePoint, and we'll see you in the next edition.